Okay, so this is going to be a really short tutorial as an introduction to Photoshop, specifically for my ARC 213 class, which is working on a Photoshop layout project for a precedent study right now. So I've got a couple of images already loaded in Photoshop that I want to work with. In particular, a fairly lousy looking floor plan that we need to touch up. And we're going to be combining both of these onto an 11 by 17 layout just to kind of refresh you guys on the tools that we went over. So the first thing that I want to do is actually create my 11 by 17 spread, and I'm going to go to File, New. I'm going to name this 11 by 17 Dave, and I already have my width and height in. This is a landscape, 17 inches wide, 11 inches tall. 150 DPI is not perfect, but for what we're doing, 300 DPI would typically be a really good working, resolution. But for this particular project, we're going to drop that down to 150. You're going to have imagery coming from a lot of different sources, and this is a good middle ground to work with. It's a higher resolution, obviously, than 72 DPI, which is what the screen is, and what a lot of your images offline are that you find on the web are going to be. And it's not as high as a resolution as the printer, which typically is going to run at 300 DPI. So it kind of sits in the middle. It'll work fine. So we also want to double check and make sure that we're in RGB color. I'm going to say OK, and that gives me my 17 by 11 layout. If by chance you are not seeing rulers, and again, the rulers are very important so that we can create these guides. And again, to create that guide, all that I was doing was moving over onto my ruler, left-clicking and dragging one out. If I want to place one precisely at, say, 1.5 inches, I'm going to hold down the Shift key and release. Let's do another one, come down 1.5 inches, just like that. If I don't see those rulers, that's simply under View, and make sure you have a check by rulers. So what I want to do is go ahead and start bringing in some different pieces onto this layout. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer. I'm going to call this Plan, and OK. I'm going to go to my floor plan right here and just do a Select, All, Edit, Copy, Edit, Paste. And so it's going to place this into my plan view, which is fine and dandy. And if you notice, if I move that towards my guides, it's actually going to snap to my guides as well. Now, the first thing that we've noticed is it's placed this image into my 150 DPI layout, and I have absolutely no idea what scale this is now, which is kind of a bummer. So what we need to do is actually set up a system so that we can scale out this plan. So let's consider that let's just make a guess, and this is probably wrong, but it'll work. This outside edge to outside edge is 64 feet. That happens to be right at 4 inches. So if I create a guide here at 2 and another guide at 6, what I need to do now is scale this image so that outside edge of wall and outside edge of wall line up on those two guides. So to do something like that, I would go Edit, Transform, Scale. I'm going to hold a corner, left-click and drag while holding Shift to make sure I maintain the proportions. If I'm not holding Shift down, this happens. And when we're trying to scale something, generally that would be construed as something bad. So I'm going to go ahead and just sort of work this in so that the outside edges are just about on the walls. And I'm going to use the arrow keys to just kind of nudge it a little bit as well. And again, I don't want to be rude about how I say this, but in terms of doing a layout like this particular precedent project, precision is kind of your enemy. Get it close and be happy, and hit Enter to accept that change. If I'm working on a precise construction document drawing, I would never want to use this method. I've got to make sure things are perfect and precise. But in terms of doing a visual representation layout, using that technique to scale is probably just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these guides just by dropping them back onto the ruler. Now, the next thing that I really noticed that's a terrible problem on this is this terrible scan or photograph or whatever this is of this floor plan. It looks generally crusty. I really don't want this to read as gray. I want this to read as a white piece of paper. So what I'm going to do with this particular layer is go to Image, Adjust, and I'm going to start by looking at brightness and contrast. So let's zoom in on this image just a little bit. And I want you to pay particular attention to these sort of really light colored lines. That might be some detail that I want to keep. Image, Adjustments, Brightness, Contrast. This is usually where I start. And I typically like to use Legacy for work like this because it's a little bit harsher in terms of how it works brightness, contrast. And what I would typically do is raise the contrast and raise the brightness until I feel like, okay, I've got black lines on a white background. However, in this particular case, I'm losing quite a bit of detail unless I can kind of find just the right way to balance it. If I start to balance it, I don't quite get rid of all the gunk over here. So I'm going to click OK on that for right now and zoom out and realize that that's just really not quite acceptable. So I'm going to go back to my history and let's go one step back in terms of brightness contrast. And I'll close the history dialog back. So, you know, in this particular case, brightness contrast didn't work. So a way to control brightness contrast in a really similar kind of mode, but with more precision, is called curves. And so if I look at the curves panel, I can see basically I'm adjusting darker tones to lighter tones, darker tones to lighter tones on this sort of XY grid. And I know what I want to do is I want to, in general, push things lighter. But where things are darker, I'm going to push them a little bit further in this direction. And where things are lighter up here, I'm going to move them in such a way that I'm maintaining these lines, ideally, while creating more of a white background. And I'm going to start to work these curves until I get it right about where I want it. And what's happening is I'm kind of equaling out the tone on the background. And now I should be able to go back to brightness contrast, raise the contrast and the brightness, and not lose some of that detail right through here. So I'm going to continue to increase the brightness, continue to increase the contrast. Let's turn off Legacy. Let's see if I can get the same kind of thing to happen. So that's not working for me either. I'm going to go back to history again. So if you haven't figured out, I'm picky about this kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do next is we're going to try curves one more time. Adjustments, curves. I'm going to pull up the center point, pull down the darker points to try and help soften those down a little bit. And get something pretty close to that. And that's, you know, for what I have, that's not so bad. And I know what I can do next is actually get rid of some of this junky stuff right through here. And I'm going to be a little bit of a slop artist about it. You should be a little more careful than I'm going to be. I'm just going to use a mid-sized brush, about 75 pixels, 76 pixels, a fairly hard edge on it. And I'm just going to come right across that to do sort of the first pass of getting rid of the majority of that. If I zoom in just a little bit closer, I can start to use the polygonal lasso. to be more precise. You know, there are parts that I don't want to erase, parts that I do want to erase. And in general, I can start to work my way around the drawing pretty quickly. And I'm going to come back up here and go select, deselect. So you kind of get the idea about how to clean that up pretty quickly. Ideally, and I picked a particularly difficult drawing, I wasn't quite able to get it, a little bit more work, and I think I probably could. But you kind of get the idea about cleaning these things up so that they fit well into the overall background. So the next thing I want to do is go ahead and bring in an elevation kind of image. So I'm just going to, again, go select all, edit, copy, edit, paste. So the reality is this floor plan and this elevation don't have anything to do with each other, but I'm going to lie. I'm going to go ahead and pretend like they do. So I'm going to kind of line up, even though this is a photograph, I'm going to line up this edge right here. I'm going to do edit, transform, scale, and I'm going to pull this edge up in this direction, kind of with the idea of lining up portions of this plan and portion of this photograph. I'm going to slide it down just a little bit. Again, I'm just kind of using the arrow keys right here to do that. I'm going to hit enter. And this time what I'm going to do is going to go ahead and crop off the top portion of that image. And I'm going to do that by using a gradient tool. Because again, I don't want to get rid of all of it. I just kind of want to soften it off as it comes across the top. So to do that, I'm going to go to my gradient tool. Right here at the paint bucket. And I'm going to send it from white to transparent, which is that gradient. And I'm going to start the gradient just outside of my selection, and I'm going to send it to just inside of the selection, something like that. I'm going to actually do that one more time to make it just a little bit more impactful. We'll make that 3 more times. And what you can see is that's actually providing a system that's fading that out as it moves away. Select, deselect. And what you're seeing is that image is starting to fade out and reveal, you know, not such a harsh edge up at the top. And again, should probably use just a little more delicacy in terms of how I'm dealing with that right here. There's a little bit of an edge here, a little bit of an edge here, but you kind of get the idea of how I can start to get those tools to work to blend in a series of images to create a board. So adding text, text box. I'm going to drag out a box to place text into. I'm going to select the color of my text in this case. Let's use the eyedropper here. Right here to select a specific green tone. And we'll start actually looking at the size of the text first because that was humongous. It is 125.58 point. That's really odd. I'm not sure what that came from exactly. I'm going to drop that down to 18. And then we can start placing text. So again, text is its own layer. It can be stacked just like any other layer can. So you want to make sure you know exactly where it's located at. Make sure that you're working with the point size. And at any time that you're working with text, as long as you're still seeing this T in your layer list, it is text that you can go back and pretty easily select and edit. So the last thing about this tutorial that I want to make sure that we're going through with you guys is saving out this file. I'm going to do a file, save as, and I want to maintain my Photoshop file, save. That's going to keep all of my layers and all of that work intact. What I need to give to the printers, file, save as, JPEG, 11 by 17 Dave, save, and OK. So in short, don't just place images on here and leave them be. Spend a little bit of time editing them, cleaning them up, and making them look as best as you can.